the things that made his whiskey especially notable Hello and welcome to My Tiny Bottles, the project where I'm exploring my grandmother's legacy of miniature liquor bottles, one tiny bottle at a time. I'm your host, Tammy Coxon. I am really getting a crash course in Canadian whiskey as I work my way through Grandma's bottles. Bottle number 103 is Wiser's very old 18-year-old Canadian whiskey. The Wiser's name hasn't come up on My Tiny Bottles before, but it's one of the oldest names in Canadian whiskey, going back to 1857. That's when J.P. Wiser first started working for a relative, running his distillery in Prescott, Ontario. 5 years later, J.P. became the sole owner, although he only had 2 years to enjoy it before the distillery burned down in 1864. But J.P. rebuilt bigger and better, which allowed him to be successful while the other smaller distilleries in Prescott failed to thrive. One of the things that made his whiskey especially notable was that he was aging it from the very start, using both new and recharred oak barrels. This was at a time when many distillers were simply coloring their whiskey. In addition to being a very successful businessman with both the distillery and a thriving cattle business, he was quite the political mover and shaker. J.P. had been born in Trenton, New York, but eventually became a Canadian citizen and was elected to the Canadian Parliament. His influence and the reach of his whiskey continued to grow, even after another distillery fire in 1887. Bottles of Wiser's, as opposed to barrels and kegs, were introduced at the Chicago's World's Fair in 1893 and are thought to be the first labeled as Canadian whiskey. He was capitalizing on the reputation for quality of Canadian whiskey that I talked about in Bottle 82, Canadian Club, and his was among the best. A lasting legacy seemed at hand, and given that I'm still talking about him today, I suppose he does have one, but it didn't go down like you'd expect. The son that would have taken over the whiskey business died in 1895. J.P. himself passed away in 1911, and a year later, a third fire would strike the distillery. This time, there was no rapid rebound, and in 1920, his descendants sold the distillery to Canadian Industrial Alcohol Company. They rebuilt it to make industrial alcohol and merged the whole thing with another long-standing name in Canadian whiskey, Corby's, to form their Consolidated Distilleries division. The 40,000 gallons of already matured Wiser's whiskey was shipped to Montreal. There, it became a variety of Wiser's branded products which made their way into the U.S. during Prohibition, like Pebblebrook Kentucky-type bourbon and Old Hickory Eastern Rye whiskey. When that stock ran out, they just started putting the Wiser's name on their own whiskeys, with no attention to matching the recipes that had built the Wiser's reputation. The rest of the 20th century was composed of a series of mergers and acquisitions that I spent too many research hours attempting to untangle and which would no doubt bore you to tears. The TLDR is that the Wiser's brand today is under Corby Spirit and Wine, which is owned by Pernod Ricard and runs the Hiram Walker Distillery. While that distillery is the birthplace and current home of Bottle 82 Canadian Club and all of its offshoots that I've talked about in previous episodes, Pernod Ricard doesn't own the Canadian Club brand due to its anti-competition laws. So the Hiram Walker Distillery actually flies giant Wiser's banners, and Wiser's branded whiskeys have been made there since 1991. Which brings us to my tiny bottle. Wiser sold their 18-year-old whiskey under a number of different names through the years. In the 1970s, possibly earlier, it was called Wiser's Oldest. But my bottle is Wiser's Very Old, and that name doesn't show up in newspaper ads until 1998 and continues to appear until 2005. When next I start seeing references to an 18-year-old whiskey, it's in 2015. And then, and still today, it has no accompanying name, just the age. So 1998 to 2005 for this one, which would make it one of the younger bottles in Grandma's collection. Pity then that it was packaged in a plastic bottle and shows significant evaporation, because at least one spirits reviewer thinks it was really a fantastic whiskey. In 2015, Chip Dykstra from the Rum Howler blog tasted a bottle he'd bought in 2006 and gave it a nearly perfect score. Wonder if he has any left he'd like to compare with Grandma's minis, so I could have a chance to taste it how it was meant to be. If you know Chip, send him this episode. You could share it with some other friends too and hit the like and subscribe buttons while you do. I always love to hear from you, so leave a comment here or at social media or at mytinybottles.com. Cheers!